Today, we examine what happens when climbers betray the people trusting them with their lives. From greed so personal it led to stolen equipment, to making a decision mid-rescue so cold-blooded it left even experienced Sherpas shaken. What followed in each case was so devastating that it still haunts everyone who witnessed it. It was May 14th, 2015, and Everest's Camp 4 sat at 26,000 feet on the South Col, a wind-swept saddle of rock and ice where temperatures hovered near -20 degrees Fahrenheit, even in afternoon sun. Tents clung to exposed terrain, anchored with buried gear and prayer that wind wouldn't strengthen beyond what nylon could withstand. Derek Hoffman, 39, from Boulder, Colorado, had summited 6 of the 7 summits and spent 18 months training specifically for Everest. He had paid $68,000 to join a commercial expedition and brought along Paul Reeves, 37, from Manchester, a climbing partner he had known for 8 years. Both men were experienced and motivated by the same goal. What Derek hadn't mentioned was that summiting first between them mattered more than their friendship. Tsultrim Norbu, 42, from the Khumbu Valley, was Derek's assigned Sherpa guide with 12 Everest summits over a 15-year career. His income supported a household of 7, including his mother's medical expenses after a stroke. During the afternoon rest period, Derek noticed Paul's oxygen cache contained 3 full bottles and 1 partial, while his held 2 full and 2 partials due to a packing error. The difference meant Paul would have slightly more oxygen during the summit push, potentially allowing him to climb faster. Derek made his decision while Paul slept. He swapped 2 of Paul's full bottles for his own partials and returned without anyone noticing. The bottles were identical, same manufacturer, same faded labeling from weeks of handling at altitude. The summit push began at 11 p.m. under clear skies. In the rush of final preparation, headlamps, regulators, harnesses checked in the dark, Paul grabbed his first bottle and threaded the regulator without examining the gauge. At Camp 4, where oxygen-starved brains prioritized sequence over scrutiny, verifying gauges with numb fingers was the kind of task that got skipped when the team was already moving. Derek, Paul, and Tsultrim climbed together toward the balcony at 27,600 feet. Paul moved slightly ahead, his pace strong. Derek followed, conserving energy. Around 3:30 a.m., at approximately 27,800 feet, Paul's regulator began delivering inconsistent flow. He checked the gauge and discovered his first bottle was nearly empty. He switched to his second and continued, assuming the first had leaked. By the south summit at 28,700 feet, his second bottle was also running low. The realization arrived with altitude-sharpened clarity. Both bottles had been partials. He turned to look at Derek, who climbed steadily behind him with no oxygen concerns, and understood immediately. Tsultrim checked Paul's remaining oxygen, saw perhaps 90 minutes of supply, and recognized that continuing would leave Paul without oxygen for the entire descent. He told Paul they needed to turn around. Paul descended from the south summit with Tsultrim accompanying him, while Derek continued upward toward the summit. The descent on limited oxygen was brutal. Paul's coordination deteriorated rapidly, his hands losing sensation as blood flow prioritized his core. Tsultrim shared his own oxygen intermittently, but the sharing meant both men were functioning in zones where their bodies were actively dying. At the balcony, Paul collapsed. His breathing had become shallow, each exhale carrying a wet rattle that Tsultrim recognized as fluid building in the lungs. Tsultrim radioed for emergency support, and 2 Sherpas climbed up from Camp 4. The descent required 3 hours of careful lowering, with Tsultrim managing rope work while fighting his own oxygen deprivation. During one transition, he wrenched his shoulder badly, catching Paul's full weight after a stumble, the joint tearing in ways that would require surgery. They reached Camp 4 just after noon. Paul was placed in a tent with oxygen flowing at maximum rate, but his condition continued to deteriorate. His lips had turned gray, his responses fading to murmurs. The oxygen deprivation above the south summit had triggered high-altitude pulmonary edema that was filling his lungs faster than supplemental flow could compensate. The damage had been accumulating for hours, and the body had passed the point where intervention at 26,000 feet could reverse the spiral. Paul Reeves died at Camp 4 at approximately 4:30 p.m. on May 15, 2015. He was 37 years old. His lungs had filled with fluid that altitude and exhaustion had made inevitable the moment his oxygen ran short above 28,000 feet. Derek summited at 6:15 a.m. and descended without incident. When he returned to Camp 4 that afternoon, Paul's body had already been covered. The confrontation that followed was witnessed by multiple climbers. Derek claimed he had made a mistake during gear checks. No one believed him. Sultram's shoulder injury required reconstructive surgery that cost more than his expedition earnings and left him with permanent reduced range of motion. He retired from high-altitude guiding. Derek was quietly banned from future Nepali permits and never returned to the Himalayas. It was July 8, 2016, and K2's bottleneck stretched 600 vertical feet above Camp 4, a steep couloir of blue ice angled at 50 degrees and hemmed beneath a hanging serac that could collapse without warning. Dawn light filtered into the gully as climbers descended from the summit. Temperatures sat near minus 30 degrees Fahrenheit. Rachel Winters, 34, from Sydney, had summited K2 4 hours earlier alongside Tom Clarkson, 41, from Vancouver, a climbing partnership that had survived 5 years of expeditions, but not the messy breakup 3 months before this climb. Both were experienced on technical peaks, and both had insisted they could remain professional despite personal history. Mingma Bote, 38, from Fortsay, was Rachel's assigned Sherpa with 3 K2 summits across 9 seasons, an exceptional record on a mountain where most veteran guides counted 1 or 2 ascents as a career's worth. His wife ran a small guest house in Namche Bazaar, and his 3 children attended boarding school in Kathmandu. The descent had been manageable until Tom's crampon caught on buried rock near an anchor point. He stumbled sideways, slammed into the ice wall with his shoulder leading, and felt the joint dislocate with immediate, nauseating pain. His right arm went useless, his breathing shallow as shock set in. Mingma clipped into the anchor above and assessed the injury. Tom could not use his Jumar, could not brake during rappels, could not self-arrest. Descending the remaining 10,000 vertical feet would require Mingma to manage every transition while keeping Tom upright and attached. Rachel had continued descending during the initial assessment. When she realized what had happened, she climbed back up and listened while Mingma explained the situation. Her response focused on risk rather than partnership. Staying in the bottleneck increased exposure to the serac and burned time they needed for safer altitude. Mingma countered that Tom could not descend alone. Rachel's position was that Mingma was being paid to guide her, not Tom. She took the spare oxygen bottle, the emergency bivouac sack, and the first aid pouch from Mingma's pack and continued descending alone. What followed was 6 hours of exhausting technical work. Mingma lowered Tom through sections too steep to descend normally, rigged anchors at every opportunity, and physically supported Tom's weight during traverses where balance was critical. Other descending climbers passed with brief expressions of concern, but no offers of help. By late afternoon, Tom had stopped responding. His core temperature was dropping, his speech dissolved into fragments, his legs bearing no weight. At approximately 6 p.m., still 800 vertical feet above Camp 4, Tom lost consciousness. Mingma anchored him to the fixed line and checked for a pulse. Faint, irregular, but present. He radioed Camp 4 and was told a rescue team would come at first light. The serac overhead made nighttime movement suicidal. Mingma stayed clipped beside Tom through the night. Temperatures dropped past minus 40. He shared his remaining oxygen, alternating the mask between them in intervals that kept neither adequately supplied. Sometime before dawn, Tom's breathing stopped. Mingma checked the pulse at his neck and found nothing. He continued holding the mask against Tom's face for several minutes before accepting what the mountain had decided. Tom Clarkson died on K2's bottleneck at approximately 26,400 feet. He was 41 years old. The rescue team found Mingma at first light, hypothermic, severely dehydrated, unable to stand. Medical evaluation in Islamabad revealed acute kidney injury from rhabdomyolysis, severe enough to require dialysis. The damage ended his ability to function at extreme altitude. He returned to Nepal, sold his family home share to cover medical expenses, and never guided above 20,000 feet again. Rachel defended her decision as consistent with mountaineering protocol. The climbing community quietly ensured she would not be welcomed on future Himalayan expeditions. Quick reminder, if this kind of in-depth breakdown matters to you, subscribing helps keep these stories coming. Now let's get back to the mountain. It was September 28, 2014, and Manaslu's Camp 3 sat at 23,500 feet on a snow platform, carved into the steep face, tents buffeted by wind that had been building since midday. Above camp, the route continued toward Camp 4 and the summit pyramid, another 3,000 vertical feet of technical climbing through terrain where weather determined their survival more than skill. Craig Hollis, 43, from Denver, and his climbing partner Elena Rossi, 29, from Milan, had met 2 years earlier on Cho Oyu and discovered they shared the same appetite for 8,000-meter peaks. Craig had summited 3 of the 14 8,000ers, Elena too, and both had committed to climbing the remaining peaks together. What Elena didn't know was that Craig had been quietly competing with her since the beginning. She was younger, fitter, and acclimatized faster. On Makalu the year before, she had reached the summit 45 minutes ahead of him, a gap Craig treated as a humiliation he never mentioned but never forgot. Nima Gyalgen, 35, from the Rawling Valley, was the expedition's lead Sherpa with 9 climbs above 8,000 meters. He had survived an avalanche on Dhaulagiri in 2011 by recognizing fracture lines forming across the slope before the slab released. That instinct for reading conditions had defined his reputation ever since. On the afternoon of September 28th, Nima reviewed weather data and brought concerns to the expedition leader. The jet stream was dipping south faster than predicted, with winds forecast to exceed 60 miles per hour by the following evening. The summit push was postponed. Craig received the news with visible frustration. That evening, he approached Elena and proposed an alternative, a fast, alpine-style push the next morning, just the two of them. He showed her the same forecast data Nima had reviewed, but framed it differently, emphasizing 12 hours of manageable wind before conditions deteriorated rather than the storm system closing behind it. Fast climbers could summit and return before the window closed. Elena hesitated. She trusted Sherpa judgment more than Craig's interpretation, but Craig pressed with a confidence that made caution feel like timidity. Their partnership was built on pushing limits together. She agreed. They departed Camp 3 at 2 a.m. on September 29th without informing anyone, carrying minimal gear, 1 oxygen bottle each, a single rope, and no bivouac equipment. The climb went well for the first 5 hours. They bypassed Camp 4, moving on to the summit plateau where altitude pressed down like a physical weight. Elena moved ahead, her pace noticeably stronger. By 25,500 feet, Craig was falling behind, 40 yards, then 60, then 100. At approximately 11 a.m., still roughly 1,000 feet below the summit, the weather changed. Wind speeds jumped from 25 to 40 miles per hour within minutes, driving spindrift that reduced visibility to arm's length. The window Craig had promised was slamming shut hours early. Elena told him they needed to descend immediately. Craig refused. His response revealed the calculation beneath the partnership. She could go down if she wanted, but he was continuing, and she would need to leave him the rope. The demand forced Elena into a choice: abandon her partner above 25,000 feet in a building storm without shared safety equipment, or stay. She stayed. They continued for 30 minutes before Craig's pace collapsed entirely. At 25,800 feet, he sat down and could not stand again. His legs had failed. Elena tried pulling him upright and felt the dead weight of a body that had stopped cooperating. The storm was fully overhead, visibility near zero, wind gusts hitting 50 miles per hour. She radioed Camp 3 and reached Nima, who had discovered their departure hours earlier. He told her to begin descending immediately. Elena could not move Craig. She tried for 20 minutes. He was semi-conscious, his exposed skin waxy. His shivering stopped, a sign his body had exhausted its ability to generate heat. Nima reached them at approximately 2:30 p.m., after climbing more than 2,000 vertical feet in deteriorating conditions with one Sherpa and emergency oxygen. They got Craig onto supplemental flow, but his core temperature had dropped too far. Nima rigged a short rope system, and they began lowering him, while Elena descended ahead. During one steep section, Nima's anchor pulled loose and shock-loaded his back up, slamming him into the slope. His ankle buckled and snapped. He continued on the broken ankle, accepting that permanent damage was accumulating with every step. Craig Hollis stopped breathing at approximately 4:15 p.m. on September 29, 2014, at roughly 24,800 feet on Manaslu's upper face. He was 43 years old. Nima confirmed no pulse and made the decision to leave the body and focus on getting the remaining climbers down alive. The descent to Camp 3 took 6 more hours through whiteout conditions. Elena survived with frostbite requiring partial amputation of 2 fingertips. Nima's ankle fracture required 2 surgeries that left him with limited mobility and chronic pain. He retired from guiding and returned to farming in the Rawlwailing Valley. His career ended at 35. Investigation confirmed Craig had misrepresented weather data to convince Elena to join an unauthorized summit push. It was June 3rd, 2017, and Broad Peak's descent from the summit required navigating a steep ice face at 25,800 feet. Hard blue ice, angling past 50 degrees for roughly 400 vertical feet. The fixed ropes had ended below the summit ridge, forcing teams to rig their own rappels through unprotected terrain. James Thornton, 50 from Cape Town, had summited Broad Peak 6 hours earlier alongside Annika Peterson, 33, from Oslo, a climbing partnership formed during the expedition rather than built over years. Both had previous 8,000-meter experience and had hired private Sherpa support. Dorje Bhutia, 44, from Namche Bazaar, was James's assigned Sherpa with 14 years of guiding experience across Everest, K2, and multiple Himalayan peaks. He had raised 2 daughters on guiding income, both now in university in Kathmandu. Dorje rigged their rappel using the team's rope, threading it through anchors he drilled and equalized on the fly. The 3 descended on that single line, Dorje managing the anchor, James clipped to a friction device mid-rope, Annika rappelling first on the lower section. Annika descended smoothly through the initial 100 feet before her crampon caught on a hidden ice screw remnant left by a previous expedition. She heard a sharp crack as the steel frame fractured at the weld joint, cold fatigued metal, failing without warning. The front point sheared away entirely. Without front points, her weight shifted backward onto the rappel device. Before she could compensate, the device slipped. She lost control, and she fell past the next anchor point in a tumbling slide that ended only when the rope connecting her to James and Dorje snapped tight. She hung suspended 60 feet below the anchor, conscious but injured, left arm clearly broken, breathing shallow from impacting ice. Dorje immediately began assessing anchor strength and rigging a hauling system to bring her back up to a point where she could be stabilized. James looked down at Annika, calculated the time required for rescue against approaching evening, and concluded the situation jeopardized his own survival. Hauling at 25,800 feet required strength he did not possess, and waiting through the night meant potential death for all 3. Without warning, he pulled a knife from his pack and cut the rope, connecting him to Annika, dropping her weight entirely onto Dorje's anchor system. The shock load slammed Dorje chest first into the ice wall, cracking ribs and driving air from his lungs. Annika dropped another 15 feet before the backup anchor caught. James clipped past Dorje and continued descending without speaking. Dorje, gasping, managed to stabilize Annika's rope and began lowering her toward a ledge. Another team reached them 40 minutes later, but the additional fall had driven her broken arm into her rib cage, fracturing 3 ribs and puncturing her left lung. The tension pneumothorax compressed her remaining lung. At 25,000 feet, where air held barely a third of sea-level oxygen, losing half her lung function created a deficit her body could not survive. Annika stopped breathing at approximately 7:40 p.m., roughly 2 hours after James had cut the rope. She was 33 years old. Dorje descended through the night with cracked ribs, making every breath an exercise in pain management. The lung injury he sustained developed into pneumonia, complicated by altitude exposure. leaving him with chronic respiratory issues that ended his career above 20,000 feet. He returned to Namche Bazaar and opened a small trekking supply shop. James claimed the rope had been damaged during Annika's fall. Witness testimony and rope inspection contradicted him. The cut was clean, made with a blade, on undamaged rope. He faced no legal consequences but permanent exclusion from the mountaineering community. It was September 19th, 2013, and Cho Oyu's advanced base camp sat at 18,400 feet on the Tibetan Plateau. Tents arranged across gravel flats with views toward the mountain's north face. Prayer flags stretched between camp structures, and the thin air carried the smell of yak dung fires from nomad encampments below. Marcus Lane, 42, from Seattle, and his climbing partner Ben Whitfield, 34, from Portland, had been friends since college and expedition partners for 6 years. Cho Oyu was their first attempt at true extreme altitude. Both had secured sponsorships from the same outdoor apparel company, $8,000 each in exchange for branded content. The arrangement had been collaborative until the sponsor informed both men that only one would receive a renewed contract for next season, based on whose content performed better. The announcement transformed their partnership into a competition, neither acknowledged openly. Karma Chiring, 37, from Solukhumbu, was contracted to provide high-altitude support for both climbers at a rate of $5,500 plus a $2,500 summit bonus. His family owned a small tea house on the Everest Base Camp Trail, and the expedition payment would fund repairs before the next trekking season. The summit push departed Camp 3 at 24,300 feet on October the 7th under clear skies. Marcus, Ben, and Karma climbed together on snow slopes leading toward the summit ridge. By 26,000 feet, Ben was moving noticeably faster, his acclimatization slightly better, the difference now visible. He pulled ahead by 50 yards, then 100. Marcus watched the gap widen and felt the sponsorship slipping away. At approximately 26,400 feet, Marcus stopped and called out to Karma. He told him he was feeling dizzy and needed assistance immediately. Karma descended and assessed him. Oxygen saturation, 71%, consistent with what both climbers had been showing at similar altitudes. Pupils reactive, speech clear, balance steady. Karma saw no signs of edema or acute distress, but Marcus insisted his symptoms were worsening. The request forced a choice that commercial guiding ethics made nearly impossible to refuse. A client reporting symptoms at 26,400 feet required attention, regardless of whether the guide's assessment agreed. Leaving a reportedly symptomatic client could constitute negligence. Karma stayed with Marcus. Ben continued alone. What Marcus had calculated was that Ben would now be without Sherpa support on the upper mountain. The summit ridge wasn't technically dangerous in good conditions, but the final section included a steep face where a fixed rope had been partially buried by recent snowfall. Climbers with Sherpa support were guided around the burial point. Climbers without guidance followed the visible rope until it disappeared and had to navigate the gap alone. Ben summited at 10:40 a.m. and spent 20 minutes filming content. He began descending at 11. At approximately 26,600 feet, he reached the buried section, probed the snow with his ice axe, and stepped onto what appeared to be consolidated surface. It collapsed beneath him, an undercut wind feature where snow had deposited over empty air, creating a false floor above a steep, walled depression in the ridge. Ben fell through the crust and tumbled down the concavity, his ice axe ripping from his hand. He slid roughly 25 feet before catching against exposed rock at the base. The fall broke his left leg below the knee, a compound fracture where the tibia punched through his gaiter. His right wrist shattered on impact. He came to rest fully conscious, staring up at the hole, aware he could not climb out. Marcus and Karma reached his position 30 minutes later. Karma assessed immediately. Ben was injured, immobile, losing blood from the compound fracture. He radioed Camp 3 and began rigging an anchor. Marcus stood at the edge and looked down at his climbing partner. He had his camera in his hand. He filmed the scene for 11 seconds before Karma told him to put it away and help with the rope. The rescue took 3 hours. Karma descended alone, splinted Ben's leg with an ice axe, shaft, and webbing, and rigged a hauling line. Once on the surface, the descent became a slow process of lowering a man with a compound fracture down 2,000 vertical feet, while managing shock, blood loss, and the altitude that turned every medical problem into a cascading crisis. The compound fracture bled steadily, blood soaking through the splint and freezing against his leg. His core temperature dropped, as shock redirected circulation away from extremities. By Camp 3, his skin had gone gray and his pulse was threading. Ben Whitfield died at Camp 3 at approximately 7 p.m. on October the 7th, 2013. He was 34 years old. The compound fracture had bled steadily through the descent, and the altitude had prevented his body from mounting the clotting response that might have saved him at lower elevation. Marcus descended to base camp the following morning. He posted a tribute to Ben that evening. Emotional, carefully worded, viewed by 40,000 people within a week. He did not mention the faked symptoms that had separated Ben from Sherpa support. Karma told the expedition leader what had happened. His account was corroborated by oxygen saturation logs and GPS tracking data, showing Marcus had stopped climbing at a point where no medical event was recorded. The sponsor terminated Marcus's contract. The guiding company blacklisted him from future expeditions. Karma continued guiding, but colleagues noticed he had become quieter, slower to trust, and unwilling to separate from clients under any circumstances. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.